Inflation is a term we often hear from friends, at the dinner table, or on the news. Most people know that it is a steady increase in prices, which is why your grandparents will complain about what they used to be able to buy for $1. But why and how does it happen? Why don't prices stay the same? Wouldn't that make things easier? Today, we will be breaking down precisely what inflation is, why it happens, and how you can prepare yourself for when it happens. Whether you like it or not, inflation is inevitable, which is all the more reason to understand it. Before we begin our breakdown of inflation, we must first understand the principles of supply and demand. Simply put, supply is the supply of goods and services. Think of a loaf of bread on the shelf at the supermarket, while demand is the demand of the goods and services. Think of someone purchasing a loaf of bread at the supermarket. When the supply of bread exceeds the demand, the supermarket will need to reduce the price for it to sell. This is not uncommon and can be seen when limited-time offers are put on display. On the other hand, when the demand for bread exceeds the current supply, if 2 people want 1 loaf of bread, the supermarket can increase its price. This price increase is inflation, i.e., the cost of the good or service has been inflated. The rate at which it grows is known as the inflation rate. If a loaf of bread goes from $1 to $1.05, the inflation rate would be 5% as the price of the bread increased by 5%. So, in reality, inflation is just the result of demand increasing and supply decreasing, and the subsequent increase in the price of a specific or fixed variety of goods. In this example, we used a single loaf of bread. Still, inflation can happen with any number or type of goods and services. The key here is identifying and explaining what causes a shift in the demand or supply of a good or service. A general rule of thumb is that a change in direction and pull can happen as a result of 3 causes. 1. Demand pull effect. 2. Cost push effect. 3. Built-in effect. This video will explain how each effect results in inflation and why COVID drastically affected the current worldwide economy and inflation rates. Demand pull effect. When a country faces a nationwide quarantine and all businesses are forced to shut down, how does its citizens afford to pay for the necessities, such as food, housing, and water? In response, a country will typically take on debt to provide its citizens with cash to help get them through. When a country gives its citizens too much money, however, the demand for certain goods can increase due to the demand pull effect. This is one of the 3 causes of inflation, and happens when the demand for goods and services is pulled upwards due to overstimulation from cash and credit. When COVID led countries to quarantine, the average person was expected to remain in their home until it was stated otherwise. If a person cannot leave for work and earn a living, the question is, how do I earn money and pay for what I need? The answer for most countries is to provide their citizens with a consistent supply of cash, money, to provide for themselves. During COVID, this was done worldwide on an enormous scale for long periods. The United Kingdom faced quarantines for over 6 months, resulting in a large amount of debt incurred by its government. Because most businesses were expected to close, the goods and services people could spend their money on became very limited. This caused more money to chase fewer goods, resulting in increased demand. Suppliers were forced to raise their prices to meet the demand for these goods. This is inflation. Think of a mother making her weekly purchase of groceries for the family. She walks in and picks up a loaf of bread for $1. COVID strikes, shutting down businesses and limiting the supply of goods for all mothers around the country. Supermarkets have become the primary food source and can no longer meet the demand. As a result, the supermarket decides to increase the price of a loaf of bread to $1.05. The inflation of the cost of bread was 5 cents, and the rate was 5%. Demand pull effect influenced the inflation rate during COVID, as more money was given to citizens. The variety of goods on offer was limited, which resulted in a price increase and inflation. In the context of COVID, demand pull significantly impacted inflation rates worldwide. However, it is only one piece of the puzzle, as the cost push effect also affects the prices of goods and services. Cost push effect. While restrictions were put on the citizens of each country, so too rules were put on the company's workers who were allowed to stay open. When companies are forced to meet the demands of sanitary expectations, how can they maintain the efficiency of production lines? Companies worldwide were forced to face this problem. It was becoming challenging to produce the same amount of goods while simultaneously following the strict guidelines of COVID safety and spread prevention. Because of this, efficiency was depleted and the relative costs of production increased. Companies were forced to increase the price of their goods. This is known as the cost push effect and is the second cause of inflation. COVID forced many businesses to close. However, essential services were allowed to stay open, provided they met the guidelines focused on preventing the spread of COVID. Examples of these businesses were supermarkets, petrol stations, and hospitals. When we look at supermarkets, we can see that the guidelines prevented employees from operating at their usual efficiency. Procedures such as working 2 meters apart, wearing face masks, and strict routine sanitations are a few of the restrictions. This was not only true for the supermarkets, but was the same for the wholesalers and distributors. This caused a domino effect of production efficiency not being met. Therefore, slight price increases were implemented to offset each business's losses. The cost increases of production are then pushed onto the consumer through retail prices, where the name cost push effect originates. When we look at the mother buying the loaf of bread for her family, we see the price of the bread increase by 5 cents due to the consumer's increased demand. Because suppliers also felt the impact of COVID and raised their prices, the retailer, supermarket, was forced to push this increase onto the consumer, resulting in an additional 5-cent increase in price. The inflation of the cost of bread is now 10 cents, and its inflation rate is 10%. During COVID, it wasn't hard to see how this increased the price of goods. Friction was added to the supply chain on all levels. As a result, everything has to follow suit to combat its losses. COVID could not affect not only the consumer, but the supplier as well. Built-in effect. When the dust is cleared and all is said and done, what happens to the overall value of the currency and purchasing power of the consumer? Simply put, it decreases. This results in an imbalance, as now a person who was able to purchase a certain standard of living is currently unable to. The mother who had budgeted for 4 loaves of bread is now forced to buy only 3. In response to this, the general public will usually call for an increase in wages to help offset the decrease in purchasing power. This is known as the built-in effect and can significantly impact the inflation of a country's prices. After the price of goods and services increased due to demand pull and cost push influences, the overall purchasing power of an individual went down. This means that $1 will no longer buy you what it used to. This is inflation in a nutshell. The gradual price of products results in the decreased value of a single dollar. This is the reason you will hear your grandparents complain about how they used to be able to go to the movies and purchase food for the price of $1. In contrast, today, it could cost you as much as $40 for the same thing. This is essentially inevitable and can't be avoided. However, it can be alleviated through the subsequent increase in wages. These are sometimes known as living wages. A living wage is a wage a country might set to accurately display the amount of money needed yearly to meet the demands of a predetermined quality living standard. This is usually done by a third party separate from those providing wages, so that the outcome is without conflict of interest. When the average salary of an employee does not meet the standard living wage, there will usually be a demand to increase the maximum compensation. When the average salary of an employee has increased, a business will need to offset these new expenses somewhere, which usually comes from an increase in the product or service they are offering. In the context of a mother buying a loaf of bread for her family, the price of bread may have increased by 10%, and her wage may have also increased by 10%. This means that the relative cost of the bread is back to what it was beforehand. However, as a direct result of the wage increase, a business owner may increase bread's price by 5% again to offset these new expenses. And thus, the endless cycle of inflation begins again. From this, you can see why inflation is inevitable. The pendulum constantly swings from left to right, causing consumers to have more purchasing power, followed by less purchasing power. Why is inflation so high? In 2022, inflation rates rose to unprecedented levels worldwide. The inflation resulted from policies and restrictions put in place to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, as well as the cash influx for quarantined businesses and individuals. In a COVID post-world where there is a higher amount of cash and fewer amount of resources, it is easy to see the effect of demand pull, cost push, and built-in economic influence on the price of general consumer goods and services. It is essential to understand that inflation is an inevitable outcome of the current economic structure we have in place. Not all inflation is terrible, but the current rates do pose a risk for the average consumer. During times of high inflation, the best thing you can do is take a step back and be smart about what you do with your money. During high inflation, experts suggest the following. Invest wisely in things such as stock and commodities. Try not to have an excess amount of cash on hand, and above all else, don't panic. The economy will bounce back, and eventually, deflation will result in the purchasing power of the consumers going up. The scales of the economy are constantly going up and down, forever in a cycle of positive and negative effect. The best thing we can do is watch videos like this, so that we can better understand what is happening and why it is happening.